What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It is Henry Zamota and my good friend Danny Abdeljabbar. What's up, man?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. My good friend and mentor, Victoria Nuland, resigned yesterday. Or was it today?
Yesterday.
Yeah, our good friend of the show, Victoria Nuland, one of our mentors and idols, has resigned from her position as the undersecretary of state. So she was the third most powerful diplomat in the United States, and she's also the husband of Robert Kagan, the brilliant Robert Kagan. And we have to just honor her career. There's nothing else to say but to honor her brilliant career. Our friend and mentor, Victoria Nuland. What will we do?
You know what's funny about that is that, she, when you say that name, she riles up a good amount of people, and I've never really cared about Victoria Nuland.
Yeah, I think it's just her whole aesthetic, to be completely honest, is just, it adds to her history. I mean, I don't want to make this an episode
About Victoria Nuland, right?
Going over Victoria Nuland, but she's the chief. I mean, I would say that she's among the chief architects of the U.S.-Ukraine policy, or the U.S. policy, and
she was hawkish
with Russia
on Russia.
and Ukraine.
She was hawkish on
and
Russia.
That I mean, the policy's working. The policy worked. There's only a war that has killed hundreds of thousands of people in 2 years. Yeah. That's the only thing that. Yeah. And so what? She got caught saying "fuck the EU" on a hot mic.
Yeah.
But our friend and mentor Victoria Nuland has resigned. It is a sad day, but it's time to celebrate her brilliant career. Okay, why don't we start today's episode? So, we are going to talk about, well, I guess maybe we should do some backstory on why we're doing this episode, and I guess what our plan is.
Well, I think what's funny about that is that we we actually had a miscommunication about what the topic was going to be today. And I was working on one thing, and Henry was working on another thing. So we just kind of landed on the one that was more baked out, which is really funny. But we're going to be talking about Haiti today, and to kind of give some back context as to why there's been a lot of news about Haiti recently, and they've been experiencing what can only be described as a humanitarian disaster that's fueled by, among many things, political turmoil and of course, gang activity.
Yeah, and just to give a little more context into so we were doing an episode. We were talking about doing an episode on slave rebellions. So, we were looking into the Nat Turner slave rebellion, and of course the Haitian Revolution, which was a huge slave rebellion. And really, the goal was to compare it to modern, contemporary political situations going around in the globe. Most, to be specific, the conflict going on in between or in Gaza right now. But we'll try to tie that in maybe towards the end of this episode. But just to you probably see that Haiti's in the news if you read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Even my wife asked me today, was like, hey, like, she's pretty apolitical and doesn't follow this stuff. She's like, did you hear what's going on in Haiti? And
surprise.
Just to give some background. So Haiti is a very low income country with very deep structural weaknesses. It has a high level of poverty. It has an unskilled labor force. It has heavy dependence on imports, and it virtually has no industrial base. Its entire economy is based off subsistence farming. The country is facing a significant crisis, and in Haiti, seems to be a crisis perpetually. To be completely honest, that's the only way to really describe it. But right now, it's worse than other times. The situation is that there's heavily armed gangs that have caused these insecurities to basically spiral. And in addition, there's been a long-running economic and health crisis. The rates of violent crime are extremely high. And we're talking about kidnapping, murder, like rampant murders, rampant gang violence. It is the most violent country, an unsafe country in the Western Hemisphere. And right now, there's very little chance of Haiti making it out of this current crisis that we have right now without some sort of like UN-backed intervention. I'm always, lampooning against intervention, but in this case, it seems like the only way that Haiti would be able to get out of this, or there'd be some solution if there was some type of UN intervention. Because right now, one of the most recent stories is that there's really, really rapid gang violence. You may have heard the other day that there was a huge prison break where basically the plot of Scarface happened. I guess minus I guess maybe not the plot of Scarface, because in Scarface, Castro excommunicates his criminals. In this case, the criminals broke into their largest, federal prisons and released, I think, around thousands of inmates. Thousands. I don't know what the exact number is. I have the New York Times article here, but I don't really feel like pulling it up. It's thousands and thousands of these gang members that have just been released. So it's really like the inmates are running the asylum type of situation. So gangs dominate about half of the country, including about 90% of the capital, Port-au-Prince. How do you pronounce
Port-au-Prince?
Haiti's capital? Port-au-Prince. And there's just been this wave of violence on civilians, leading to mass internal displacements. Like if you really can't even travel to Haiti. If you travel to Haiti on some type of business trip, there's a good chance you'll be kidnapped, and extorted and ransomed. Haiti's law enforcement organizations are completely overwhelmed and outgunned by these gangs. They're understaffed. As of March 2023, there were 9,000 police officers for a population of 11.5 million.
Jesus.
So just to put that in context, in New York City, there's a population of around 8 million. There are roughly, I want to say, I haven't checked this. I know at its height, there was 50,000 officers. I think now that number's probably in the 30,000 something. But
even still, the smaller population and higher officer count. So it's a bigger proportion.
But we're talking about the entire country.
Yep.
Not just one urban city. There's 9,000 police officers for a population of 11.5 million, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of basically kind of Houthi rebel armed gang members. I mean, they don't have missiles and stuff like that, but you know what I mean.
Give them long enough, and they might have them.
Organized gangs. So, as a result of these security weaknesses, law enforcement organizations are kind of locked into this war of attrition with their gangs. And in addition to the security crisis, the UN estimates that half of the population is suffering from acute hunger, and there are large-scale cholera outbreaks. It sounds like the war in Yemen from a couple of years ago.
A little bit, yeah.
From 2 or 3 years ago. It sounds like the war, a Middle Eastern war-torn country where the civilian population, there's not a war going on. I mean, there's a borderline. Basically, it's kind of, it's essentially anarchy. But it's so bad that millions of people are suffering acute hunger, and cholera is a very, very easily treated disease, meaning that there's no access to clean water. So in August 2023, Kenya agreed to lead a UN-backed intervention in Haiti with the support of a handful of mainly Caribbean and other African countries. And under the plan, Kenya would provide police officers. I think they would provide 1,000 police officers, and I think some of these other countries. Believe Jamaica would be contributing some, and it's basically it's kind of like a Marshall Plan of some sort that the United States and in Canada would financially support. Like the U.S. has pledged to grant $200 million, and I believe Canada is going to grant $60 million for this intervention. And honestly, this is like an intervention that I don't really see as that big of a moral hazard, even though the U.S. does have a very long history of intervening in Haiti, going back to when I believe it's when the Bank of Haiti defaulted and basically it became owned by Wall Street banks. And basically the United States has intervened in Haitian politics since the early 20th century. And of course, like during the Clinton years, 20,000 soldiers U.S. troops were in Haiti as like a peace bringing force. So we have a long history of doing that. But I mean, it's just the structural governance issues in Haiti are just so significantly damaged that it seems like this intervention with these African states and this joint intervention with these UN-backed African states led by Kenya most likely will be smaller than interventions in the past, and also these interventions have been delayed because most recently Kenya's constitutional court ruled that the intervention was unconstitutional according to Kenya's constitution. I believe it has something to do with like a clause in their military that they're not allowed to, either their police. It's not important. It's been delayed. So this has been delayed. But really, this instability goes back. I mean, this recent burst, it goes back to 2021.
Yep. And the short version is that back in 2021, the then President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated, and ever since then, Haiti's political landscape has basically been falling apart at a faster rate than it was before then. And it led to like a political power vacuum that has been filled by these gangs. There are currently over 200 individual gangs that have been using, violence to consolidate their power, in the absence of, an elected political leadership. And they've taken over, like Henry said, large portions of the capital of Port-au-Prince and many other cities in Haiti. And these gangs have, not only engaged in turf wars between each other, but they've also dictated a lot of the aspects of daily life in these communities under their control, including access to jobs, medical assistance, and also even education. The violence has reached such a high level that, the UN recorded a staggering number of deaths and injuries and kidnappings in just 2023 alone. I think it's important to point out that the brutality of these gangs is super unspeakable. I know you spoke at length about it, but one thing that I'd add to that is that there's also been a lot of sexual violence, as well as the widespread killings and kidnappings that have been employed to kind of terrorize the population and consolidate power. And the international community, including the UN, has called for this specialized force to help the Haitian National Police, and we kind of already talked about that. But it looks like that hasn't materialized in any meaningful way. Now, while all of this has been going on, the Haitian government's capacity to provide security and honestly just even basic services has been severely undermined, which, to your point, Henry, has made the humanitarian situation even worse. And so this organization, the International Rescue Committee, the IRC, has ended up putting Haiti on its emergency watch list for the third consecutive year due to the ongoing political crisis and poverty and displacements. Now, with the majority of the population requiring the humanitarian assistance, I think this crisis is not only just a security issue, right? But it's, like you said, Henry, it's turning into like a Yemen situation. And there's been, efforts to try and prop up some political stabilization and spur on the electoral process, including plans for, doing some elections and some constitutional reforms. But these initiatives are facing some pretty significant challenges, including like a pretty big rejection by some civil groups and political parties. And that's complicating the path to restoring, these state institutions and honestly just addressing the urgent needs of the Haitian population. Now, Haiti's troubles currently with their political instability and gang violence, trace back to its fight for independence and self-rule. And that happened way back, with the Haitian Revolution in 1791. And I think that event marked the end of slavery and established Haiti as the first republic that's governed by people of African descent.
Yeah, so Haiti is the first. No, excuse me. They are the second state to declare its independence in the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
The first would be the United States, but Haiti was the second one.
Yeah, exactly. So while that Haitian Revolution stands as like a pretty powerful symbol of resistance and kind of this idea of the pursuit of freedom, it also kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of the ongoing challenges that we see today in its governance and in its economic hardships, and also in its external influences that currently sway Haiti, sometimes for the worst. Now, all governments have their share of corruption, and I don't think Haiti is an exception to this. We're not really going to talk too much about like the internal corruptions there, but to understand the current situation, I think you have to look back at the long history of political upheaval, from dictatorships to foreign interventions and everything in between, which has basically weakened Haiti's political institutions and made them more susceptible to issues like what we're seeing today with gang control, lack of security and humanitarian issues as well. Now, the gang's dominance, especially in Port-au-Prince, is I think so similar to the nation's continuous battle for power and stability, because the government is super fragile. This is a situation that has roots in the early years of the independence, and more to the point, the economic difficulties that Haiti experiences today are partly due to that historical isolation and sanctions that were imposed upon them by colonial powers, which has effectively reduced the government's ability to improve living conditions, combat poverty, address gang violence, and so on and so forth. But despite these challenges, I think that the spirit that the Haitians embody, the spirit of like fighting against oppression, which was first kicked off by that revolution, it still lives on in the Haitian people and their ongoing demands for change. So hopefully at some juncture soon, they're able to organize in such a way that's going to be positive for the people. But to move forward, Haiti has to confront a lot of these underlying issues of social inequality, political corruption, and of course the external influences that are imposed upon them. So, addressing these causes are going to be really crucial for fulfilling the Haitian Revolution's promise, which was for to have a stable, democratic, and thriving nation for these people. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? So, living in Puerto Rico, do you ever? So, I'm not really familiar with like how immigration works in Puerto Rico. I'm assuming that they have the same immigration laws as the United States. Are there ever Haitian refugees that come to Puerto Rico?
We have many. Okay. in Puerto Rico, we have the same immigration laws as the U.S. You know, when you come to Puerto Rico from a foreign country, you enter in through U.S. customs, just like anywhere else in the U.S. But being an island nation in the Caribbean, we have kind of a similar issue as what people on the border states have, right? Where the only difference is that we get migrants from boats, and a good proportion of people are coming over from DR and Haiti, for work. Honestly, they come over illegally. Of course, many of them die on the journey, even though the journey isn't very far. But they come over here looking for a better life, and the ones that are caught get sent back. But the ones that aren't are unfortunately sometimes taken advantage of, much like migrants in the U.S. Where they pay them next to nothing, to work in the fields and do jobs that Puerto Rican people don't want to do. It's kind of a ugly underbelly of the Puerto Rican economy that no Puerto Ricans want to talk about. But it's also not just it's not at the scale of southern border migrants, so I wouldn't quite compare it to, say, people being coming from South and Central America to like Texas or something like that. That the scale is totally different, but the
I'm wondering
situation is similar.
Is like, do you ever notice, because at least in like urban centers in New York City, if you go to an emergency room, in many hospitals, for example, like the hospital that was next, I used to live next to Mount Sinai Hospital, which was one of the largest hospitals in New York. Definitely one of the largest hospitals in Mount Sinai, in Manhattan. And if you went to the emergency room, then I'm not exaggerating, because I also have a lot of friends who are ER nurses. Every single person there is an illegal immigrant. So there is and they don't really pay anything, because no hospital refuses people when somebody's sick.
Right.
So there's still social services that are available for illegal migrants, especially in large cities like New York. I'm wondering if Puerto Rico has even the capability of providing that type of service to migrants.
Well, the island isn't that big, but when they're coming in from the West Coast, from DR, and the West Coast, it has one major city, Mayagüez, but mostly it's just smaller communities. So the impacts there are a bit heavier, because most of the bigger hospitals and other social services are up in the Northeast in San Juan, where I live, right? And it's not unheard of for those migrants to make their way all the way over here, but there's not also a whole lot of like work that they can have had in the metropolitan areas. Where they end up going to is the more rural communities in Puerto Rico, where they can be employed kind of under the table. So personally speaking, I don't really encounter illegal migrants super a lot in San Juan, but I can imagine just by putting two and two together that their presence is definitely felt in some of those smaller communities, from a social services perspective.
All right, why don't we get into well, I'll pull this back and say, yeah, I mean, it's super sad, because these people are living in complete destitute, and it's like, what do you do with them when it's like the moral question comes in? It's like, what do you do with them when they do come? Like, it's like, how do you send them back? But at the same time, it's like, how does your country absorb these people? But I guess, Puerto Rico experiences this at a smaller scale than what the United States is and other European countries are. But we can go on about immigration policy, which I don't think either of us have like too much of a particular interest in. I'm not necessarily a border hawk or anything like that. I have kind of just a tertiary knowledge of immigration policy, but let's not get stuck in those weeds. So let's talk about really the history. So the Haitian Revolution, what happened? What was that all about? I think most people know the high level stuff. A bunch of white people got killed by
Former
a bunch
slaves.
of French whites got massacred by the slave population. But let's talk about that.
Yep. Well, date-wise, the Haitian Revolution happened between 1789 and 1803, depending on where you pin the start or the true start of the revolution. It's kind of like a series of smaller events that led into a very big event. And it was pretty huge, specifically, in our conversation about slave revolts and this idea of fighting against slavery. This is kind of where this all kicked off, because it turned this rich French colony of what was then called Saint-Domingue into the independent country that we now know as Haiti.
Well, it's interesting. So you have to ask yourself, like we were saying earlier, that there's an African coalition basically that wants to step in and be the main driving force for like political stability in Haiti.
Right.
And you may ask yourself, like, what the hell does like Kenya have to do with Haiti? Like these are two countries that are I don't know the distance, imagine 3,000 miles away, 4,000 miles away.
Man.
It's got to be further. We're crossing the Atlantic Ocean here, and then Kenya is on the other side of Africa. So like, why the hell are they? Why do they care about what's going on in Haiti? Well, the reason why is because it's like a symbolic. Haiti has a lot of symbolism because Haiti became this symbol to the global black community because it was the first independent black state in 1804. So, given that it's it was the embodiment of African pride.
Yep, that's right. Caribbean too. They're the first state to throw off the colonial shackles. So Haiti is seen as that kind of centerpiece, for freedom. But at the time, and I might switch between saying Haiti and Saint-Domingue whenever it suits me. So forgive me ahead of time. But Haiti had the largest slave rebellion ever in the Americas, and that led to the end of slavery in this what was a major slaveholding colony. And the revolution was pretty unique because it had a lot of complex social and political dynamics that was like this weird, Game of Thronesy, factional struggle between slaves, white colonists. There were also the free people of color, so free blacks, and each of them had their own distinct and unique goals. Sometimes they lined up with one another. Sometimes they were at odds with one another. So following the whole story it gets super complicated. But some key outcomes of the revolution included representation in the French imperial legislature initially, and then later racial equality, and then after that the abolition of slavery, and then ultimately total independence. And this was a globally significant event, and it came from basically setting this precedent in challenging colonialism and making this revolution basically a landmark in history of in the history of like slavery and freedom. Now in the late 18th century, then Saint-Domingue, they became the top exporter of a bunch of important crops, so sugar, coffee, and indigo. And Europe, despite being, they sent it to Europe. Now, despite being super small and having a population of like 600,000, they were dominating in these export businesses. And, these exports were exceeding, those of major regions like Brazil and the U.S. And that, because they were a French colony, significantly boosted France's economy. And this wealth relied heavily, of course, on the labor of over 500,000 slaves, which made it by itself one of the largest enslaved populations in the Americas. Now, the society in Saint-Domingue was pretty sharply divided. It had a vast majority of enslaved people that were under a small elite of whites and also a small group of free people of color, so free black people. And the enslaved people were pretty diverse themselves. They had groups like the Creoles and, of course, just Africans. And despite the brutal conditions of those plantations themselves were kind of hubs of cultural preservation or even cultural blending, which is how we end up, with the current culture of Haiti. And this was particularly noteworthy among the African populations. And
yeah, I was looking into like where Haitian slaves came from, and I was under the impression that they mostly came from like Western Africa, but they came from everywhere in Africa. They came from Central Africa. They came from Western Africa. I'm not sure how many came from Eastern Africa, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, and this is something that I'm actually curious to learn a lot more about, because I really am kind of ignorant about this, is the diversity between different slave populations. So what was the diversity? I guess if you took a bunch of slaves from different parts of Africa, was there like some type of conditioning that you had to do to get these slaves to speak the same language and things like that?
Yeah, I imagine there must have been a small language barrier, but one language that oppressed and enslaved people all understand is violence. So,
I'm talking about like if they are cooperating in the field, like how do they?
That's how
communicate with each
Creole.
other?
That's how the Creoles were created. Creole is just like a mix of a bunch of different cultures and ethnicities, right? So, currently, for example, the Haitian language is like mostly like French, but it has strong influences in the many different African languages that were, a party to it. And I imagine that they probably taught them proper French, or at least, functional French, so that they can understand the commands that they were given. But
well, yeah, I mean, most African country, I think the predominant language is spoken in Africa is French, then English, and then it's the tribal, then it's whatever tribal language.
Yeah,
that different groups belong to, which they speak at home. But French is the primary. For sure, I think is the number one spoken language in Africa.
Yeah, I mean French culture. Haitian culture is super interesting because of how like diverse and like how it's interesting for me at least to see how they adopted different parts of different cultures that they made up. It's truly a Creole culture, which is I find it really fascinating. But where was I? Oh yeah, so you had all these enslaved people. And, the dynamics were, obviously overwhelming population of enslaved people, small population of non-enslaved people. But surprisingly, at least in the early periods, resistance to that enslavement was relatively rare. Most people chose to just escape rather than openly rebel. And so they would make their ways to the Spanish side of Hispaniola, or they would find their way onto a boat and try to get somewhere else. But the mix of these resistance tactics included some pretty interesting things. Like apparently they were heavily using voodoo to try to resist enslavement, which is fascinating in and of itself. Not really sure how much that helped them, but just kind of was an interesting point that I read about. And in doing these voodoo practices and some of or just straight up escaping, it kind of started hinting at this like brewing revolution, because there was an increase in number of young African men, and many of them had potentially military backgrounds from where they came from, and there was also this worsening living conditions that's just happening in the background. It starts putting together the possibilities of a rebellion.
Well, I want to ask you two things. So the first thing I want your perspective as someone who lives in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. Is voodoo like a Caribbean thing, or
I'm not super into or aware of the roots of voodoo, but from what I understand, I think voodoo is a Haitian thing. Though many cultures around the world practice some form of occult magic. One I can think of, in Latin American cultures would be brujeria. I don't. Puerto Rico being primarily a Catholic state, it's not really a thing here. Although I'm certain that there are populations of people that do some form of occultism, but it's not really super prevalent in Puerto Rico.
because even how some Caribbean folk worship Catholicism, there's like a mix of like some tribal heritage into their worship.
For sure.
Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, for sure. Even here in Puerto Rico, we have like Afro Caribbean Puerto Ricans who incorporate a lot of African root. One very clear and very loud component of this is the music style bomba, which is basically just drums. If you listen to it, I mean, probably some of our episodes might include it in the background because it happens every now and again near my street. But bomba is basically just like drum circles with chanting over it, and the thematic themes often talk about the motherland, like African roots and things like that. So, of course, there's also a bunch of practices and things like that here in Puerto Rico that can trace their lineage to African or native Taino stuff. So I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know if I'm qualified enough to answer the question though.
Well, one time, my mom was visiting me when I lived in Brooklyn, and my mom's a very, very devout Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a local Catholic store. There was like a Catholic store, whatever that means, that
You buy your Jesus wares.
Yeah, buy your Jesus wares,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't like a traditional, Irish Catholic or Polish Catholic type place.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a Dominican Catholic place.
Okay.
And
So
my
they have,
mom
like,
went in
brown
there and she was
Jesus?
like looking for, a rosary or something. Like your standard rosary or like your little notepad with John Paul II
Right.
on it.
Right.
And she came out and she was like, I think that they had voodoo in there because it was like mixed. There was so much of like the old tribal stuff, I guess, infused into a lot of like the idols that they had, that she was just completely confused.
There's a word for this, and it's when a religion incorporates elements. I'm going to Google it. Word for when religions incorporate cultures. There's a word for this. Syncretism. So this is where faiths, cultures, and customs bounce off and combine with one another in a process called syncretism. A good way to describe syncretism is like, you ever see like Black Santa Claus or like Asian Jesus? You ever see those like those images? That would be kind of like light syncretism. More heavy syncretism would be like having a Christmas tree, which was a pagan thing, or placing the birth of Jesus on December 25th, which is probably closer to the solstices, right? So syncretism happens in every religion and every culture, some more than others. And it's interesting that you bring up the anecdote about your mom going into a Dominican Catholic store and basically encountering, syncretism and misunderstanding it as voodoo.
Yeah, she was like, is that voodoo in there? It was funny. But I digress. It's an interesting topic.
For sure.
I don't know. Maybe we can talk about that in another venue.
Some syncretisms.
But another thing, so another thing that you mentioned, I don't want to get too off track of the main thing that we're discussing, is just like the amount of slaves that were in Haiti versus the amount of French colonists. And you have to think, and this is the same, this is kind of like the main undertone of the, the conflict between the states, or at least the slavery question in the United States, and why Southerners were so eager to ensure that the institution wasn't messed around with, because you're talking about a lot of young men who are of military age and who are big and strong and who work with their bodies, that, hey, if these guys really wanted to, they outnumber you, and they're they're physically fit, and they can take power if they organize. Like,
Right.
there's no chance. And that was a lot of the undertones that was the undertone in the American Civil War, not the American Civil War, but in the antebellum South, because you had these states, where the majority was, whites were the minority by a lot. And if the slaves decided to revolt, then there would virtually be no chance to
suppress that.
to suppress that.
And the Nat Turner revolt was one of those big ones. But I think the moral of that story is just don't enslave people, and you don't have to worry about it.
Well, yeah, I think one of the reasons why we took this topic on is because we're trying to compare, the concept of is it more? I guess the moral question is it morally right to have a slave revolt, even if that leads to the killing of innocents?
Right.
But which the Haitian Revolution, indeed, just like the Nat Turner and just like John Brown, all these guys, noble cause to end slavery, obviously, but in that process, the massacre of innocents took place.
Right.
So not just men and military targets, but women and children.
Right.
So that's where the line, the moral line is like, okay, yeah, this institution's completely evil, but at the same time, murdering women and children are evil. And that's, kind of the same logic when discussing Israel-Palestine and the conflict going there. Obviously, Hamas killing civilians, both Danny and I condemn it.
Right.
But it's the system that they're in place. It's just like, what do you expect that happen ultimately?
Right.
And then the same case with slavery, what do you expect to happen when one group is suppressed to the absolute nth degree? Like, there's no other greater level of suppression than chattel slavery.
Right.
We're not talking about there were black slaves in the United States who did live in situations like this, where their slavery was more like what it was like in like ancient Rome, where you had your educated slave who handled your business affairs and stuff like that, and they inherited your things after you died. There were incidents. Nat Turner being someone from that, not to jump from that kind of tradition, not saying that his experience was great, but he came from like more of a I guess progressive slave owner, if I can even say the word, like a nicer slave owner who educated him and all that. But we're talking about these guys in Haiti were cattle slaves. They were worked. They were worked in the most inhumane conditions you can possibly think of. And
there were slaves as they were slaves in the truest sense of the word.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say that slavery in the U.S. was good. I'm saying there were cases where some slave owners would be a lot more lenient than other slave owners. But yeah, sorry to digress. But I just wanted to talk about bring up the idea of just, all right, so these people are in a cage basically. And what happens when you release them from the cage?
Or what happens?
They're obviously not going to be happy with you.
What happens when you keep them in the cage for too long? I think is a better way to put it, But we're getting a little bit off the rails here, so let's come back to the French Revolution, because this I think is a pivotal moment that sparks off the Haitian Revolution. I think it's a strong influence on it. So, the beginning of the French Revolution, in 1788 was, I think, among many of the reasons that caused France's monarchy to collapse financially, and this pretty unexpectedly swept up the society that was in Saint-Domingue into a political storm. The colony's wealthy planters, like that class of wealthy planters, they initially wanted just more trade freedom and some autonomy from France, and they started bringing in a lot of other social groups. On the other hand, the white population gained some democratic rights and representation in Paris, which pretty much sidelined the royal authorities, and they ended up creating a new constitution in 1790. Meanwhile, we have this group of free coloreds who were the free black people in Haiti, who were almost as their population was almost as large as the white population, which included the wealthy farmers, and they faced a lot of legal discrimination in Haiti, despite pushing for equal rights that were ultimately inspired by France's revolutionary ideas, right? And the National Assembly, they attempted to address racial discrimination and slavery, but this worried both the colonial and French merchants, which led to a delay in addressing, the slave trade issue and also the rights of the free colored people for over a year. And so that sparked some protests by these free blacks in Saint-Domingue, which were unfortunately violently put down. And that set a precedent for the Haitian Revolution's brutal tactics, right? They ultimately saw that as a cue, okay, the only way that we can get anything done is with violence. And so the issue of racial equality, it just became more complex with this rise of poor white people in Haiti and their political power growing, and also the linked struggles of the free colored people and the slaves, all escalating tensions. So these three groups, poor white people, free black people, and slaves, all kind of working at this moment for the same goals, and they're all aligning against the French merchants, the monarchy, the wealthy plantation owners, people like that. So that's what the stage looks like at this point. Now, in 1790, a Creole revolutionary, a merchant and military officer, and he was also a goldsmith, by the name of Vincent Ogé, he ends up leading a failed revolt. And that revolt was a reaction to the National Assembly's decision to grant some of the free blacks rights in May of 1971, which they quickly reversed because they got backlash from the colony. So by then, there were uprisings among a bunch of these free blacks and large-scale slave revolts in August of 1971, which put Saint-Domingue on this course towards a wider revolution, with the other revolts significantly weakening the white colonial control of Saint-Domingue. In the early stages of the French Revolution, slaves in Saint-Domingue watched from the sidelines, basically, as the tensions were rising between the whites and the free coloreds. There were minor uprisings on plantations here and there in late 1789, but those were quickly put down. But by the summer of 1791, after the crackdown on the Ogé Rebellion, and also among rumors of the French king's opposition to the revolution, the slaves started kind of formulating hopes for freedom, and but they misunderstood the idea of freedom to mean things like partial liberties, like 3 free days a week. Like at that point, all they were hoping for was like a weekend, basically. Now, the significant slave uprising in August 1791 started in the northern plain, was, I think, more influenced by the political turmoil in Saint-Domingue, which was weakening the colonial control, than it was influenced by the ideology of the French Revolution. So while it had some similarities, I think they had more localized concerns and more localized influences. And this rebellion was led mainly by elite slaves and Africans, and driven partly by religious practices. So I think voodoo here. And they were looking to overthrow colonial leaders and gain control over large areas, despite those initial setbacks in those urban regions. And the goals of this uprisings varied, right? Some leaders were willing to negotiate to a return to modified slavery conditions. Think like, slaves get a weekend. But others were, looking for total freedom. And, these mixed goals were seen by some to be kind of pragmatic or realist, while others saw it as a potential betrayal. So now we start seeing the groups that are fighting for independence or autonomy or freedom start to fight a little bit amongst each other. Despite the French military efforts, the slaves' guerrilla tactics, though, and also their knowledge of the terrain, made them really tough enemies to fight against. At the same time, revolts by these free blacks in other provinces blocked support from the northern whites, which further complicated the conflict. Now, I know at this point we're probably getting confused at what's happening, but honestly, you should be confused because the different factions vying for power, sometimes aligning with each other, sometimes working against each other, is what made this conflict so complicated.
So it's like my impression was always that it was just a straight up racial war,
right,
between the white French and the black slaves, but there's like a much more confusing, onion or iceberg to go under.
For sure. And there was obviously, a huge overtone of like, blacks versus whites on this, right? There was enduring racism and also just indecision from France on what to do about Saint-Domingue, right? And what to do specifically about the free coloreds, who were skilled in combat and familiar with the land, who were pressing for rights, and sometimes they were aligning with slave insurgencies. So, there's definitely that major component of like, whites versus slaves or slaves versus whites. But it's way more complicated than that. It's not super cut and dry. Anyway, on April 4th, 1792, there was a decree that ended racial discrimination in French colonies. And this was a direct outcome of recognizing the significance of this group of free coloreds who, if you remember, there were almost as many free black people in Saint-Domingue as there were white people in Saint-Domingue. So they couldn't just like ignore them. So they tossed them a bone and they said, okay, fine, no more racial discrimination against the free black people in Saint-Domingue. But the colonial struggle got worse with the onset of a lot of the European wars that happened at the time, specifically between the French and the Spanish and the British, which limited French reinforcements in Saint-Domingue, and it exposed them to invasions from external parties. There's this guy, a radical abolitionist named Léger Félicité Sonthonax. It's a hard last name. And he ends up, he was a leader at the time, and he ends up just unilaterally declaring that slavery in Saint-Domingue is abolished in 1793. And Sonthonax was basically a civil commissioner in Saint-Domingue, but what was important about him is that he controlled 7,000 French troops during that part of the Haitian Revolution. So he had the firepower. He had a position of power. He you know basically had the strongest claim to do something there. Now, from September 1972 onwards, he becomes one of the de facto rulers of Saint Domingue's non-slave population, and that kind of gives him that authority to make the call to abolish slavery. So, but despite his lack of like a formal authority, he wasn't like elected or appointed in any official capacity. I think this unilateral abolition of slavery was a huge turning point in this clusterfuck of a story. After that emancipation, attempts to maintain this plantation economy that was formerly the only economy in Saint Domingue was essentially forcing farmers or forcing former slaves into like a quasi-serf system, right? They needed to keep up the economy, and now slaves are free. So how do we still keep up the economy? Really, the only way to do that is to force people into this like caste system where they end up being effectively still slaves, but under the title not slaves. And this new system was resisted by many who would have preferred to turn the economy into an independent farming economy, which is what we see right now, subsistence farming in Haiti. In some regions, there was still plantation control that resisted the emancipation decree. As with any state that has slavery and then, slavery is then abolished or threatened to be abolished, there's always going to be groups or regions that are going to resist that change, for any number of reasons, paramount of which are probably the financial reasons. And this led to further complexities and concessions and foreign powers. And, I'll bore the hell out of you if I keep going on this particular point. But I want to talk a little bit about some important characters. So some background here. For 5 years after the onset of the war and foreign occupation in Saint Domingue, this old planter class was basically dismantled, right? And in its place, they set up this new kind of quasi-egalitarian, but definitely multiracial society that just happened to be under French rule. And while the influence of the free people of color initially increased, it soon became undercut by the rise of former slaves. So despite Sonthonax's emancipation efforts, many continued to fight, and some even sided with Spain or Britain due to the period's complex loyalty. So now you got people fighting alongside invaders or alongside these foreign entities. And there was a significant development, which was when the National Conventions put out a decree in 1794, which basically abolished slavery across all French colonies and granted citizenship to former slaves. So now, at this point, France catches up to Sonthonax in Haiti and says, all right, fuck it. All slaves are free now. We're abolishing slavery everywhere, and all slaves are now citizens. And this move was part of the Reign of Terror's radical phase, which aimed at undermining British influence in the Caribbean. I guess they figured, all right, well, we're not doing so well in this war. Maybe we just make everyone happy so that we can get more, popular support and potentially win this war. But through, I should say, although this idea was very revolutionary, right? Get rid of slavery. I think this decree's actual enforcement was pretty uneven. So many in Saint Domingue were still forced into labor under restricted rights, and other colonies of France either resisted or only partially applied those new laws. However, technically speaking, the action did liberate 600,000 people in Saint Domingue, and it did influence the war. And this gives rise to a lot of new figures, like a guy by the name of Toussaint Louverture, whatever, Toussaint. And he was a former slave who rose to prominence because he had a pretty remarkable skill in military affairs. Now, despite the emancipation policy that Frontenac, put out, like I said before, a lot of the insurgents were initially fighting under the Spanish or British command, and the movement towards abolition gained momentum, especially after what was the first multiracial election in Le Cap. And Toussaint played a crucial role during this period. He, like some of the other slaves, initially was aligned with Spain, but later he shifted his allegiance to the French after France finally, figured it out and abolished slavery, which and him aligning with France afterwards, basically, it significantly contributed to France reclaiming the territory of Saint-Domingue. His leadership was a critical piece in the entire, Hispaniola Islands history, especially after Spain handed over control of Saint-Domingue to France in 1795. Under Toussaint, he built a super diverse army, which included former slaves, mixed race people, and a few whites. And Toussaint started negotiating with a lot of these third parties like the British for their withdrawal, and he pretty effectively got what he wanted. He consolidated a lot of power, and he basically put Saint-Domingue on a path of, towards new social and political systems, which would ultimately end in the liberation of whatever remaining slaves there were, and shaping Haiti's future direction. Now, it wasn't all easy, though. Toussaint's job was really tough. He had to do a balancing act between preserving the colony's economic foundations, the issue of, okay, all these people are free, but our entire economy is based around slavery, so, how do we figure that out? But he also had to address a lot of the freed population's demands for independence and land, right? They all want a place to live. They all want a place to set up, their own subsistence farming. So how do you do that? Well, his idea was to introduce a system of remunerated forced labor. And this is just a fancy word for basically forcing people to work for free or for very little in order to keep the plantation economy afloat. But obviously, this didn't go over so well and sparked some resistance from, all those people who were hoping for more substantial reforms. And this created a bunch of internal conflicts, such as the War of the South against André Rigaud. And this exposed what would honestly still be relevant, which is an underlying class and racial tension. Toussaint's government, particularly with the introduction of an 1801 constitution, also kind of raised questions about his intentions and his ability to balance that free labor with the colony's economic needs and hopes for autonomy. And as Toussaint tried to manage these challenges, Napoleon Bonaparte comes onto the scene. He takes power in France, and he throws a wrench in the whole thing, and he looks to reestablish control over the economy. He threatened the progress that they were making towards autonomy, and he also started hinting at possibly reinstating slavery. So now suddenly it gets much, much more complicated. And Napoleon, he ends up sending a formidable-sized army to Saint-Domingue to exercise his will. And this mission was backed by not only just France, but also other regional powers interested in European dominance over what was, formerly a slave-led society. And it honestly, it looked like a global attempt to regain control over Saint-Domingue and make it like a slave state again.
Well, when was the last time a slave army took control of a state? I mean, is it I mean, prior to this, was it the Mamluks in Egypt?
I think
that's
so.
the only case I really know of.
Yeah.
You know, the Mamluk dynasty. They were slave mercenary soldiers that basically took over the government in Egypt for like 60 years or so.
Yeah.
I don't know what the other case is.
Yeah, I don't know. It's definitely unprecedented. So there was like this global, interest in like reversing course on that. So as Napoleon sends a bunch of his troops over and starts to, flex his dick muscle a little bit, in 1802, leaders like Toussaint and also another guy who I didn't even talk about, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, they end up capitulating to France. They were basically told, hey, you guys can keep your titles and that we won't touch the, slavery issue, that will keep abolition the thing. But of course, this was a lie, right? The French plans were to reinstate slavery, and racial biases started to surface, which started a fierce rebellion, which was led by mostly black generals and free people of color who had initially sided with or returned to, the French side of the deal. And so this independence war was obviously marked by extreme violence, and this is the part of the story that you probably have heard of when you think about the Haitian Revolution, where the French were employing just absolutely ruthless tactics, but also the indigenous armies were resorting to scorched earth methods. In 1803, the resistance that was set up, that was led by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, to basically declare independence, they did that. They figured it out, and in January 1804, they declared independence, and they adopted a new name, which was the island's ancient name, Haiti, to establish kind of like this unique identity for, its African descended population. And the Declaration of Independence, it highlighted the critical need to separate from France to avert like re-enslavement, and it openly criticized French colonial rule. And this phase of the revolution also saw some brutal orchestrated attacks on French settlers. I mean, they straight up murdered white French people on sight, and like Henry said before, it wasn't just military age people, it was women, it was children, like anyone who was white was going to die. And Dessalines argued, and here's Henry is kind of the point that we can talk about a little bit, but Dessalines said that all of this murder was necessary for national healing, and it culminated in laws that were set up against white ownership of property in Haiti. So here's that question that we're kind of like mulling over and honestly talking about. We're formulating an opinion on in live time here. Is this slave revolt morally acceptable, given that it's going to result in a lot of innocent people dying? And how do you feel about Dessalines' argument saying that doing all this murder was necessary for national healing?
Well, I don't condone the murder of innocent people, especially children. But it's like one of those situations where it's like, what do you expect that? Like, what do you ultimately expect to happen?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just when you oppress a population hard enough, eventually there's going to be a tremendous backlash. There's going to be, and it's just not just in a, racially wise, in the case of whites and blacks in Haiti, or, or things like the Nat Turner slave rebellion, where the same sorts of massacres took place. Sorry, you probably hear an airplane in my... Do you hear this airplane?
Not at all.
Okay, maybe it's in my head. That's why I keep on muting myself. Old school podcast. I used to be next to a train. Used to hear the train in the background. Now I live close to JFK, and now you hear planes in the background. I guess I'm moving on up.
Yep.
But to your question, like, it's extremely hard to. It's like, do you blame the slaves for the slave rebellion? Like, there's obviously a moral gray area. It's very hard to answer it. It's like, do you agree with Hamas killing civilians? No, I don't agree with Hamas killing civilians. However, you can't just decide that, Muhammad came from hell to tell to tell them to start killing Jews for no reason.
Right.
The reason why they, there was this tremendous act of violence was just the nature of the regime and the intense political oppression that they were facing. So there was a violent backlash to it.
Right.
And then, I mean, you can just look at any case outside of even, these more contemporary cases. Just think about the episode that we did, our last episodes, talking about the
genocide of the Germans
against Germans in Eastern Europe, and we mostly spoke about the Danube Swabian population in Yugoslavia, where, like, a lot of Germans were committing war crimes in Yugoslavia. A lot of the Germans were in the SS and were part of, National Socialist organizations. However, when the communists took over, they collectively condemned all Germans, and really no one was spared. Thousands, tens of thousands of people were killed and murdered, and hundreds of thousands were forcibly expelled.
Right.
Like, do you condone that, even though that there are war crimes committed by not everyone, but by,
a good proportion
some
of that
segments of the
population.
population? No, it's not. Revenge killings aren't acceptable.
Right.
However, in this case, it's like, how much agency can you put on a former slave population? It's like a really hard. It's a very difficult question to answer, because no sane person condones. Like, we're going to talk about Nat Turner in a future episode, but just to give you kind of synopsis, like the Nat Turner slave revolution or slave rebellion, you could call him a jihadist.
Yeah, you could.
Like that. I mean, because he thought he was inspired by God to lead this rebellion, and that slave revolt, they not only killed women and children, but they beheaded women and children. They brutally, they disemboweled people. Like, it was a brutal slave revolt. But then again, it's like, what do you expect to happen? When you. And I guess maybe in hindsight, people in the early 19th century, late 18th century didn't have this precedent, or nor did they have the same, moral compass that we have now, or where they probably mostly saw the black population as subhuman. Where they literally were probably, in their eyes, benevolent to some degree. It's like, oh yeah, we're taking care of these people. It's just like kind of the natural order. We run the systems and they do the labor, and they're happy and we're happy. And, sometimes we'll let them marry and give them a little bit of, throw them a bone every once in a while. But the relationship, all in all, is just a natural circle, because, our race is superior.
Right.
But I don't know, man. It's a difficult question.
It really is.
I don't condone murdering innocent civilians, like most rational, normal people. But to some degree, it's just like, that's just what's going to happen when that's just the natural reaction of humankind, is to have these violent outbreaks when you're oppressed.
For sure.
or systemically oppressed, rather.
Well, kind of getting back to the topic, I have another pretty interesting bit about this. So, we see under Dessalines a massive revolution happen, and they win, right? They take full control. They declare independence, and we're thinking, okay, cool. Now Haiti's free, but very interestingly, Haiti ends up becoming a military autocracy that is led by now Emperor Dessalines, which is, I thought that was really fascinating. Like, how do you go from, one autocracy to another,
Well, that's usually what happens.
Yeah.
Because who's going to hold the line? Like,
Right.
who's going to hold up the fragmented society? And also, there's the threat of your oppressors coming back. So, of course, you're going to hand the power to a strong man.
Mm-hmm. Which is, I think, sometimes the fear about, giving the Palestinians a state, right? I think probably it makes a little bit of sense to be afraid that, they turn into an evil autocracy hell-bent on getting revenge,
I mean, in probably what would happen, I mean, there's a good chance that would happen where, let's just say, if the Palestinians were granted a state, and I'm not trying to make the Zionist case right now.
Right, right. Let's make
I'm
that
just
clear.
trying to look at the perspective.
Right.
And what probably, or there's a high, at least a more than likely or medium term chance of happening where they would say, okay, we got a state. Let's never let this happen ever again.
Right.
let us, let's revert to militancy and kind of hand our power to some strong man who will.
Well, I mean, that kind of happened in Gaza, right? When you think about it, like in 2006, when Israel pulled out, they allowed autonomy for the Palestinian state. And you can argue, as a result of the systemic oppression of the people in Gaza when they were under direct control of Israel, they turned to their strongman, which happened to be Hamas. And since then, there hasn't been a single election, if you noticed. And they are a de facto military autocracy. Just like a mini
Well, yeah,
one.
there's no doubt. I mean, they are. Hamas is very oppressive in its own right, but it's just you're always going to put your power. If you have like this history of, if you look at like authoritarian regimes or kind of these militant authoritarian regimes, there's always this previous gripe about getting screwed over.
Right.
I mean,
Happens all the time. Everywhere.
you're going to put your, I guess the main priority if you're a citizen for your state, what you want your state to do is to protect you. So you're going to put the strongest, meanest guy possible to ensure that, you're not invaded again, or you're not enslaved again, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And sometimes those people end up being your worst enemy. But back to Haiti, Emperor Dessalines eventually dies, and with his death ended the military autocracy, and Haiti eventually evolved into a republic. But Haiti remained split by regional and societal lines. In the aftermath of the revolution, it was super bleak. I mean, there was a widespread loss of life, huge ruin of infrastructure, and of course, plummeting exports, which made recovery just abysmal. And the shift to this peasant-driven economy was the formerly enslaved population's dream come true. I mean, they wanted to set up their economy as a subsistence farming thing, but it came at a really high cost. Globally, Haiti's status as an independent black nation was, it became a beacon for Africans worldwide, and it was also kind of a concern for colonial regimes worldwide. And despite facing just a shit ton of trade and diplomatic barriers, Haiti eventually won recognition, notably from France in 1825. But that came at a cost too. They agreed to a large indemnity, and basically Haiti had to pay France off to get that recognition. But they eventually end up forging ties with the United States and the Vatican's in the 1860s. So, there's that. But all of this came with a whole lot of repercussions. So, from the beginning, the Haitian Revolution grabbed global attention. It got a range of reactions from the global population, from fear, opportunism in many cases, to even just admiration. That slave revolt sparked celebrations among Jamaican slaves, which influenced the British stock market. And it was also seen by the Cuban planters and the London Times as a chance for profit, because they wanted to step in, and be the next big exporter of coffee and sugar and stuff. By Toussaint's death in 1803, his story made headlines worldwide, which, I think it underlined the revolution's broad impact on the world. And to talk about the outcomes of the revolution, it was pretty complex. It ended a major market for the Atlantic slave trade, but it didn't significantly dent the volume of slave trade in the 1790s. It did free a bunch of Caribbean slaves, but ironically, it actually increased slavery's growth in other places due to a higher tropical product prices, and also because French colonialists were relocating and doing slavery elsewhere. And then the collapse of Saint Domingue's plantations, that shifted global coffee production to places like Brazil and Jamaica. And that, of course, was helped by a lot of the French exiles. There's also cultural and social influences of the refugees from the revolution, which enriched areas like Cuba and Louisiana, despite the different impacts, depending on the location that you're talking about. Also, nations worldwide were worried about the influence of black immigrants from the French colonies. So a lot of them took measures, specifically Spain, to curtail immigration restrictions. So another big outcome was that the revolution dealt a blow to the imperial ambitions of France, but also Spain and Britain. And it played a part in France's imperial decline. And interestingly, it indirectly influenced the Louisiana Purchase, which expanded the U.S. territory. So you could make the argument that the U.S. wouldn't be the U.S. that we know without the Haitian Revolution, which is fascinating. The revolution also fed into a lot of discussions on humanitarianism, and also, unfortunately, early stages of biological sciences, which later influenced 19th century scientific racism. It inspired abolitionists and racial equality advocates all over the world, but it also provided material for those that were trying to advocate for racial hierarchy because of the obvious implications. So, it's the Haitian Revolution's legacy is pretty complex in that respect. Its impact on race relations and abolition movements is pretty hotly debated, and its direct influence on Latin American racial discrimination abolition, it's considered a bit minimal on that front, but it did heighten racial fears in the Spanish Caribbean, and it left a lasting impact on Hispaniola's racial dynamics, which, frankly, could be a whole conversation in and of itself. People like Simon Bolivar and Thomas Jefferson saw Haiti as a warning, and it shaped their views on race and government. And throughout the 19th century, the revolution inspired black political activism, but it also stoked white fears of similar revolts, which, kind of highlights its multifaceted legacy there.
Yeah, and what's you can't understate is how this impacted the attitude towards slavery in the American South.
Right.
Because again, going back to just like Haiti, the American South had very large black populations. A lot of these white French, they ended up as refugees in the United States, and a lot of them ended up in Louisiana. And stories went around of what happened, in that these black slaves, they came and they massacred our town. So that played into, you can't understate how that played into the zeitgeist of the early 19th century or the mid 19th century in the U.S. when it came to the question of slavery.
Super important.
We're almost at an hour and a half right now.
Okay, so we can cap it here. I think it's a good segue to talk, in next episodes about, some of the pre-Civil War politics in the South, specifically around slave revolts there and how that played into it. I think this could make for a very interesting conversation.
All right. Well, let's end it right here. Thanks everyone for listening to another episode of Bro History. If you like the show, make sure that you rate and review. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, you can also join our Patreon. Danny, is there anything you'd like to add?
Nope.
All right. Peace, guys.